This place will do nothing for me. All I can think of is getting home. Experiencing the approved school in England in the mid-20th century. This paper was given for the Children's History Society Biennial Conference, Children and Young People, Speaking Up and Speaking Out, in June 2021. My name is Jessamy Carlson and I'm a PhD student in the Department of Sociology at the University of Essex. I just want to give you a warning that there is some discussion of self-harm in this paper and language used which we would not find an acceptable way of describing individuals in the 21st century. This paper draws on an unpublished report held amongst the personal papers of Professor Julius Carlebach at the Institute of Criminology at the University of Cambridge. Carlebach was an associate professor of sociology and head of department at the University of Sussex from the late 1960s and died in 2001. Carlebach was instrumental in the research which led to the publication of the formative white paper Children in Trouble in 1970, which in turn influenced the reforms made in youth custody provision in the aftermath of the Children and Young Persons Act in 1969. Prior to this, he and colleagues had been working on a comprehensive study of girls resident in approved schools titled Promiscuous Puritans, which, unusually, includes detailed interviews with a number of girls committed to the school. Carlebach was critical of contemporary studies of delinquent girls and argued that what was needed was a comprehensive and systematic analysis of delinquent girls and their needs. He undertook a pilot study and a sociological analysis of 8 approved schools for girls and, with research assistant, included over 50 interviews with the girls themselves, psychological profiling of the girls, and interviews with staff in the schools. This report is the only such study I have come across in my 4 years of research, with such extensive interviews with children committed to the approved schools. The voice of the child in any form is all but absent in this area of research, and it is on that basis that I have drawn upon it. Approved schools for girls and boys operated in England and Wales between 1933 and 1973, and an estimated 500,000 children passed through their doors during this 40-year period. Children were committed to these schools after an appearance, usually several appearances, in the juvenile court, and were committed for 3 years or until their 16th birthday, whichever was soonest, with usually a period of at least 3 years licensing after they were released from the school. Single-sex institutions, the children committed to the approved schools comprised 9 boys to every 1 girl. Operating outside of the welfare and education systems, and approved by the Home Office, these schools are somewhat understudied. The schools for girls were divided into junior for girls between the ages of 10 and 14, and senior for girls between the ages of 15 and 18 until 1948, when their structure was rearranged to mirror the arrangement for the boys. Thereafter, junior schools took girls under the age of 13, intermediate schools took girls between the ages of 13 and 15, and senior schools took girls between the ages of 15 and 18. The experience of the boys dominates the discourse around approved schools, which is not entirely surprising given that upwards of 90% of the children committed were boys. However, boys and girls were committed to approved schools for very different reasons. Upwards of 65% of girls were committed to approved schools under care, protection or control orders, while more than 95% of boys were committed having been convicted of a criminal offence. It's worth noting that this report refers exclusively to girls in senior approved schools, and therefore presents a limited picture of the realities of life in the approved schools. Whilst a very useful piece of work in this field, it is nonetheless not fully representative of the scope and scale of the work of the approved schools, and, I would argue, the dominance of the senior schools in this field of study has already skewed our understanding of the extent and experience of the approved schools as a whole. The experience of younger girls in the approved schools is really quite different. The rhetoric of the combination of waywardness or sexual precocity, for example, combined with offending behaviour that made older girls much more risky in the eyes of those tasked dealing with them, is not reflected amongst younger girls, who were just as likely to have been committed for frequent truancy as petty theft or care or protection. Promiscuous Puritans was positioned as a study of difficult adolescent girls in residential care, and drew on interviews with girls committed to 8 schools as a case study. These schools were assigned code names, the names of towns in Highland Scotland, but it is easy enough to identify the schools, which were as followed. Alford, a code name for Longfords in Minchinhampton in Gloucestershire. Fairley, which was Bowden Hall School in Gloucester. Dallas, St Joseph's School in Nantwich, Cheshire. Hatton, which was Farringdon House in Exeter, Devon. Elgall, St Euphrasia's in Monmouthshire. Gary, which was Ryall's Court School in Seaton in Devon. Katrine, which was St Michael's School in Salisbury in Wiltshire. And finally Bullfron, which was Greenacre School in Colne, Wiltshire. This paper will consider the institutional frameworks of the approved schools and how the girls worked within and outside of the setup, how they perceived the staff and support workers, and the training made available to them. Promiscuous Puritans began with the following observation. The approved school girls' loss of liberty is a double one. First, by confinement to the institution, and second, by confinement within the institution. The confinement means that the girl is cut off from family, relatives and friends. It is not difficult to see this isolation as painfully depriving or frustrating in terms of lost emotional relationships, of loneliness and boredom. She is subjected to a vast body of rules and commands which are designed to control her behaviour. Carlebach observed that the functions of an approved school may be categorised as follows. Social rehabilitation, providing vocational, primary and secondary education, custodial care, and providing residential facilities, food, clothing, etc. Carlebach's view was that the main task is the readjustment and the social re-education of the child in preparation for their return to the community. The functions of the approved schools in the fields of education, practical training, health, recreation, leisure, social training and casework are all subsidiary and supplementary to that of the main task. Based on the extracts taken for these interviews, I suspect that not all the girls who were interviewed as part of the study would agree with this assessment. Although Carlebach too was aware of this, and observed that many of the girls expressed firm opinions both on the usefulness of the approved schools and the way in which their own particular school was run. These views were not always negative, however. For girls aged under 14, offences under the Education Act, usually persistent truancy, were a common reason for being committed to approved schools. My research suggests that as many as a third of all girls committed to junior approved schools were done so for offences under the Education Act. And with that in mind, it is feasible that a significant proportion of the girls in approved schools may have missed a great deal of schooling prior to being placed in a residential school. This enforced attendance at school for some resulted in better outcomes in terms of literacy and numeracy than might otherwise have been achieved. One girl, reflecting on her upcoming release, observed that she would miss school and the mothers. "I've learned a lot here, and now I can read." For this child, at least, there was some evidence of achievement during her time at the school, notably that her literacy had improved as a result. There is quite limited information regarding the educational provision in the approved schools, and most of my research suggests that educational attainment in the schools was a low priority. Certainly, there is very little evidence for, say, achieving good examination results, or support for studying beyond the minimum age for leaving schools. Approved schools were open institutions, and usually girls committed to such a school would attend a local primary or secondary school as appropriate to their age, but most left education, and indeed the approved schools, without formal qualifications, even in the later years of this period of study. Other girls reflected more negatively. One girl observed that, "I won't be any different putting me in here. Nothing will change. All they're doing is keeping me out of trouble for 3 years." While another girl had a more balanced perspective on her time at the approved schools. "I suppose it has helped in a way. I would have got into more trouble, but I don't think girls should be locked away." Another summed up her views in 4 words: "I hate it here." The girls interviewed for this report came from a variety of approved schools, which in turn had quite different approaches to the children with whose care they were charged. There were the schools which follow the new permissive way, like Bowden Hall, and a school where everything is centred around work, such as Greenacres, where there seemed to be no incentive for good behaviour, and, according to the girls, there is more to be said for bad behaviour. The worse you are, the more chance you have of being sent home, and if you behave, you'll be kept longer. A little over half of the 44 girls who spoke of their attitudes towards their approved schools felt that it had afforded them no benefits. Only a small number felt that they had benefited from the curriculum, and a rather large number, 12 in all, felt that they had benefited in other ways. Some of the girls had quite strong views of their current school based on their experience in other institutions. Around a third of the girls interviewed had been in more than 3 approved schools or other state-run custodial or residential institutions for children. One girl remarked that, "I liked that training school, we worked hard and there was freedom." 19 of the girls, nearly half of them, felt that the time they were spending in the school was wasted. This was the most frequent complaint amongst the girls. Others complained about the lack of interesting things to do, which follows on from previous remarks. "I get fed up with being with all the girls in the day room. There's no one to speak to except the girls, and you get fed up hearing the same things over and over again." Several of the girls interviewed expressed frustration regarding how they spent their time in the schools. One girl said, "I don't think there should be senior girls. We're all here for the same thing." Quite a large number of girls felt that the time they spent in the school was wasted. In fact, this was the criticism voiced by the highest number, 19 in all. In a time and a place where a child's contribution to the family wage packet could be significant, something at least some of the girls would have been aware of, other reflections echoed this frustration. "I should be working now, working and making money. I get fed up with having nothing to do." A family background rooted in deprivation was common amongst these children, and it is little surprise that the girls would feel the loss of their ability to contribute either to their own or to their family's financial security. School rules were a further point for discussion, and were the basis of several complaints. "The rules are stupid. We get watched all the time." The level of invigilation provoked a great deal of irritation amongst some of the girls. The notion of, or desire for, an earned freedom rings throughout a number of the responses, and this refers not only to getting out, but to having more scope for their own agency within the parameters of the approved school itself. Responses were not wholly negative, however, and other girls felt that there had been some benefits to their time in the school. "It's helped me a lot. I would never have learned to type, or swim, or play tennis, or badminton if I had been at home. Our school was no use." There were further reports of negative outcomes by the girls, and some of the reactions by the girls to the circumstances in which they found themselves start to ring alarm bells to a modern audience. Some had resorted to self-harm, citing their lack of occupation or means of passing the time. "It's something to do. They nag at you if you scratch the walls." Self-harm was reported by more than one girl within this report, and it is not clear whether it is such unusual behaviour that it is over-reported, or whether it is such unusual behaviour that the report wishes to highlight it. Other girls reported that they either felt that they had only learnt to be deceitful, or the way in which they had benefited would not have met the approval of the school. "What I do here is what they want me to do. It makes me feel sly and dishonest. On first going home I said I was sorry to Mum. That was the first time I've ever been able to say I was sorry, but I did it because if I hadn't, I shouldn't have come back here. I'm not honest." Some girls took it upon themselves not to engage too closely with their fellow pupils, perhaps anticipating further difficulties, which goes some way to indicate the level of agency a girl could have over her own experience in the school. One girl observed that, "I keep myself to myself, not because I don't like the girls, because I want to get home. I don't want to get into any more trouble." The mixing of the girls from the full range of rationales leading to committal to such a school had long been the subject of professional discourse within the approved school community, so it is interesting to note that at the very end of their tenure the same dialogue persisted, except that this time it was the girls themselves who identified the difficulties of a one-and-all approach to institutional care and youth custody. One girl observed that they put all the girls together in one big school, prostitutes, drugs, no home, and they expect us not to talk about what we've done. In a rather Victorian expression, which one might not have expected to find in a report dating from the 1970s, Carlebach noted that contamination is an ever-present problem in institutions, and it is so in the exclusively female environment too. Not only can she learn more of crime from her experienced friends, but she can also learn of sexual deviations. Sex and crime appear to be the most popular topics of conversation amongst the girls. So both the girls and the professionals were aware that bringing children together in one institution inevitably led to discussions regarding how they come to be in the school. Leading on for this, the perception of the girls with regard to the staff in the schools was on a par with those perceptions of their time in the school, although the most telling observations concerning staffing in approved schools comes from those writing the report. One contributor noted that staff attitude is very difficult to assess, and us and them attitude pervades these schools. Other reflections on the staff highlighted two extremes amongst them. In each school, one finds those members of staff who use therapeutic techniques of counselling and therapy in a friendly and permissive atmosphere. They take an interest in what the girls do and get the girls to talk about their difficulties and so on. There are, on the other hand, members of staff who believe in an authoritarian regime and want formal compliance. They look on the girls as dirty little sluts from the slums and treat them as such. Another contributor to the report noted that the deputy head of St Michael's was the only member of staff with an extreme rejecting, degrading attitude. She was obsessed with what the girls' sex lives might or might not be. The report went on to note that she had trained at HMP Holloway and compared her directly to the head teacher, who, in comparison, exerted a positive influence by her caring attitude and made herself accessible to girls who wished to discuss problems. The researcher observed that the attitudes of the rest of the staff towards the girls tended to vary depending on whether the head or the deputy head were on duty. There were some glimmers of light, however. One girl remarked, "I like Miss D the best. She shouts a lot, but I like her. She listens to me, but then she can't do anything." Carlebach noted that a fairly substantial number of the girls, 16 out of 45, liked and would confide in a particular member of staff, and several more liked a particular member of staff, but were not willing to take their worries to her. However, a larger proportion of the girls would not confide in the staff, and in several cases this seemed to be linked to a lack of trust. "We're supposed to go to the social worker, but she tells the head everything and doesn't believe what you say." Another girl observed, "I used to go to the social worker. She promises you something and then never keeps her promise." In other cases, girls felt that the staff were inaccessible or that they were in no position to help, although several girls had a particular member of staff they disliked. Almost twice as many did not, although there were some more general criticisms concerning the staff. One girl reported that, "There isn't anyone to speak to. I've been asking to see the headmistress for weeks, but she won't see me." In what we might recognise as perhaps a typically adolescent observation, one girl complained that the staff nag so. "All they do is nag me, but they don't do anything. Nagging doesn't help. I'd rather have a clip round the ear." An expectation of, or even support for, physical retribution for behaviour was common within the reflections of the girls included in this report. Although heavily regulated in a school or institutional setting, physical punishment was still legal at this point in time. Another girl observed that she didn't like any of the staff a lot. "They don't care if we swear or not. They should give us a good slap when we swear at them." In fact, several girls felt that the discipline was too lax rather than the opposite, and expressed authoritarian views. Such views were not, however, universal. One girl replied that, "Some of the rules are stupid though. I had to sit at a table alone just for making noises like a cat in the kitchen." Another girl remarked that, "I don't see why girls have to be sent to approved schools at all. If they have done wrong, they should get 3 months in prison." Many were far from thrilled at where they had ended up. One girl summed her views up thus. Vicky said that if she had known what she was coming to, she would never have done any of the things she had. She wished that she could turn the clock back and start over again, or just died now and have it all finished. A number of the girls in the school had been resident for a significant period of time. One girl recounted that she had been in the school for upwards of 6 years, and Carlebach acknowledged that in some of the schools, the danger of over-institutionalisation in these schools is very real, in the same way, though for different reasons, as other dangers. Carlebach saw the preparation of children for their eventual return home as central to the purpose of the approved schools, through the readjustment and social re-education of the child. Home, however, was not the sanctuary for all, which Carlebach was well aware of. His conclusions at the end of the report acknowledged that there is a connection between unhappy home relationships and delinquency. In addition to this, it is worth remembering that some of the girls had spent most or all of their lives in formal or informal state care, and for others, their committal to an approved school was a necessary step for their own welfare. Home might well have been somewhere they had no desire to return to, and release from the school on licence was conditional upon their having somewhere to go. One girl observed, "I don't want to leave here. I don't have anywhere to go except home." This return home, which Carlebach believed was the primary purpose of their experience in an approved school, preoccupied the minds of some of the girls throughout their time at the school. "This place will do nothing for me. There's nothing to look forward to. Home leave is a privilege, and all I can think of is getting home." Indeed, and in Carlebach's word, hardly surprisingly, most of the girls, 39 of the 45, were looking forward to leaving the school, while one girl, wanting to leave, had some reservations. "I do want to go home, but at the same time I'm scared. I'm scared in case I get into more trouble, and when I was on home leave I stayed in most of the time." The extent to which girls perceive themselves to be altered, changed or reformed by their time in the school is not clearly defined in this report, and it would be interesting to know whether their opinions changed over the course of their lives, or whether they always viewed their times in the school with such overwhelming negativity, but unfortunately such data is not available to us. In conclusion, this report offers new and more considered glimmers of insight into both the approved schools and the wider youth custody system from both the perspectives of the children committed to it and from professionals who had access to the schools, staff and residents. Having surveyed the girls in the school and the provision for them, Carlebach's main argument amounted to a lament for a lack of specialist staff for unstable girls and a proposal for systemic research and monitoring following appropriate intervention. He clearly saw institutions for girls as representing more complex and difficult tasks than almost any other residential unit. It reveals some broad observations on the failures and successes of the school. For example, it reveals that a small number of the girls felt that they had benefited from the approved school curriculum, while a rather larger number felt that they had benefited in other ways. However, little over a half of the 44 girls who spoke of their attitudes towards approved schools felt that it had afforded them no benefits. This report was written at the very end of the tenure of the approved schools, and it's telling that the remarks reveal a degree of continuity with the early days of the school. The children in the schools were able to articulate the difficulties of providing institutional care to children committed for such varied reasons, in language which would have been familiar to the early adopters of the approved schools. Indeed, this report highlights that the us and them attitudes and notions of contamination, concepts familiar to anyone who has studied the Poor Law or more broadly Victorian institutional care, were very much still in situ in the early 1970s. However, despite these significant and negative observations, the report does reveal that for some children, their experience in the school was not wholly bad. Some found a place of safety which fostered them with skills such as reading and writing, or allowed them to take on an apprenticeship. Others were simply determined that they would never return to such a school, and were determined to work their way out, while a few were genuinely unsettled at the prospect of life beyond an institution's walls. These findings reflect broader and longer trends identified in other studies of juvenile delinquency and of the experiences of social welfare and custodial institutions. So in that sense, this report reveals narratives familiar in this field of study, both of girls and of youth justice and custody as a whole, albeit in an institution which is, at present, the subject of limited scholarship.